So Hashem, today's daf is Daf Kidushin Daf 16, Kidushin Daf Tezayin, and we're going to begin from Tezvav Amid Beis, about 14 lines from the top. My Talmud Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Just the Gemara is going off on a topic just to clear things up with Eved Ivri. One of the psukim, I'm going to bring up the pasuk over here. It says that if a person gets so poor and the goy gets very rich, and the Jew sells himself as an Eved Ivri to a goy, so there's a mitzvah on the relatives to start bailing him out. It's called yigaleno. A relative should come up with the money and buy him back from the goy, because we don't want him to stay by the goy. And this is a guy that would listen to us, that the Jews that lives in the state of Israel, and that follows the Jewish law. So the relative should get him back, or the pasuk says he should buy himself back. Let's say he gets money from an inheritance or something, or some strangers should step in and buy him out. If nobody buys him out, then the pasuk says, then he stays there. No one buys him out. Then he stays by the goy till yovel. So that's a long time. Now, the Chumash doesn't say is what happens when the relative who just invested money and buys him out. What happens to the person? What happens to the Eved? So Rabbi Yossi Aglili said that that's what makes this machlokes a very interesting say. Rabbi Yossi Aglili said that if your relative bails you out, you go free. But if anybody else bails you out, then you have to work for that person. But you're working for a Jew, so it's better off. Rabbi Kiva says the opposite. If your relative bails you out, you have to work for the relative, and if somebody else bails you out, then you go free. So the Gemara wants to understand what is the reason of this machlokes. Anyway, the Gemara is going to come to the conclusion it's logical. And the Gemara says, "My time to Rabbi Yossi Aglili." What is the reason Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that if your relative bails you out, you go free from the guy? You go free. You don't have to work for the relative. If somebody else bails you out, you go work for him. So the Gemara says, "Amakra," because pasuk says, "Im lo you go el be'ela." If you're not redeemed by these people, then you still have to work. El ba'acha, if somebody else bails you out, then you have to work for that other person till yovel time. So the pasuk is saying two things: one, that if you get bailed out by your relative, you go free. But if a stranger bails you out, you have to work for that stranger till yovel. Rabbi Kiva says, "Im lo you go el be'ela." If he learns that the pasuk is saying one thing. That means if you're only redeemed by your relative, you have to work by your relative till yovel. So Rabbi Kiva put in the word elo. It's only when somebody else bails you out, then you go free. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili challenges Rabbi Akiva. Midi elo be'ela ksiv. Does it really say elo be'ela? It just says be'ela. So it's not we still don't understand what is the root of the machlokes between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva. Ela b'hai kral kol mipalgi. This is the argument. Oy doide ben doide yugalan. The pasuk says that either your relative should redeem you. Zel gulas kroivim. Then the pasuk says, "Oh, you see a or if you're rich, you can bail yourself out." Zel gulas atzmai. The nigal, the third choice is zel gulas acherim. A stranger comes in and bails you out. So there are three things that can happen: either your relative, or you bail yourself out, or a stranger steps in and bails you out. Rabbi Yossi Aglili sava mikra nidish lefonav. That means it goes forward, and therefore you compare when your relative bails you out, when you yourself bail your own self out. When you bail yourself out, you go free. So also when your relative bails you out, you also go free. So that's the way Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the pasuk is going forward. Rabbi Kiva sava mikra nidish la'achra. The pasuk is going backwards. Shade gulas acherim agulas atzmai. You put gulas acherim on gulas atzmai. Only when somebody else bails you out, that's compared to when you bail yourself out. Ma gulas atzmai l'shikra av gulas acherim l'shikra. Just when you bail yourself out, you go free. When somebody else bails you out, you also go free. But if your relative bails you out, you have to work for that relative. That's the opinion of Rabbi Kiva. So the Gemara still doesn't like that. If that was the root of the machlokes, yihachi be'ela lamali. Why does the Torah say im lo yigal be'ela? Only this way, then you have to work. So the Gemara says, "Ila be'ela." If it wasn't for be'ela, have a mina mikra nidrush bein lefana bein la'achrav. Then I would say that the pasuk is goes forward and backwards, and then no matter who bails you out, you go free. V'hakol shichra. Therefore, the pasuk is really not clear who would go free, who bails you out, and where would you work if that person bails you out. So then the Gemara says, then we're back to square one. We don't have a definitive understanding of what the root of the machlekes is because the psukim are very vague. So right here, which we're holding is like this. Just remember this. So here, let's just review for a second. There's a machlekes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Haglili, a man who sells himself to a goy, right? And comes along, a relative bails him out, Rabbi Akiva, or somebody else, a stranger bails him out. Rabbi Yossi Haglili says, if your relative bails you out, you go free. If somebody else bails you out, you have to work for that somebody else. Rabbi Akiva says just the opposite. If your relative bails you out, you have to work for that relative. If somebody else bails you out, you go free. So the Gemara wants to understand what is the root of this machlokes. So the Gemara says, it's logical that arguing in logic. Rabbi Yossi Haglili Savar, Rabbi Yossi Haglili holds. Mistavra, it seems to make sense. Gulas acherem, when a stranger bails you out from the goy, l'shibud, you have to work for him. The amrit l'shichra, if you say that a stranger steps in, pays all this money to the guy, and you go free, have a minimum like parkalei. Nobody's going to step up to the plate and redeem him because the money goes down the tubes. You pay the guy the money, and now the eved goes free. So therefore, the Rabbi Yossi Haglili says, if a stranger bails you out, you have to work for the stranger. But if your relative bails you out, your relative doesn't mind paying money for you, doesn't mind paying you money and losing the money because you're still a relative. Rabbi Akiva Sava, relatives are relatives. Mistavra makes more sense. Kulas kroivim l'shibud. When your relative bails you out, you have to work for that relative. The amrit l'shichra, if you're going to say he goes free, so then everybody call yoyim of yoyim azam mazban nafshe. Then the person's going to gamble away all his money, and then he's going to sell himself to the guy because he knows that his relative is going to step in and bail him out. So if you're going to say that he goes free, then if you're going to say he goes free, then no relative is going to want to do that. If you can say he's going to go free, that's what the guy's going to do. So that's why we say, no, we don't want you to do that. We want you to know that if your relative is going to bail you out, you're going to work for the relative. Chachamim says, no matter what, your relative bails you out or a stranger bails you out, Hakol l'shechri, you always go free. Man chachamim, who's the chachamim? Rebbe Heat. Makib lahai be'ela l'drasha achina. He uses the word be'ela for another drasha. Mikra dirush mafana bein la'acharav, and the pasuk goes backwards and forwards. So if I bring the pasuk up on the screen, v'im lo yugal be'ela v'yotzu b'shnas hayoyva. I'm sorry. I doide ben gai l'gelenu m'sher b'soy mishpachti again. I see the yod of an eagle. They're all compared. Whether your relative bails you out, whether a stranger bails you out, it's almost as if you bailed yourself out and you automatically go free. Rebbe, back to the Gemara, Rebbe, hi, what is then? When do you work? If you always get bailed out and you go free, so when does the Eved Ibri work to Yovel? The answer is if nobody bails him out. If nobody bails him out, then he has to stay by the goy till Yovel, and that can be many, many years. The boy, look at the Tanya. We go to Tazayin Amar Aleph. A guy that whose jurisdiction is under the Jewish jurisdiction, and he pays attention. He abides by Jewish law. Maybe the pasuk is talking about a guy that doesn't abide by Jewish law. What can we do to him? If he's not abiding by Jewish law, we have no jurisdiction over him. The pasuk is only talking about it's only a guy that's under our jurisdiction. And the chiddush of the pasuk is if nobody bails him out, a guy went broke, he sells himself to a guy, nobody steps forth to bail him out, then he has to the halacha is, the Torah says, if the guy is under our jurisdiction, he has to stay by the guy till Yovel. And the guy paid money for him, that's it. He's stuck by the guy. That's what the pasuk is saying. Okay, back, new Gemara. Tazayin Amar Aleph, Ubeshtar. The Gemara says that an Eved Ivri, an Eved Ivri is purchased with a star, and an Emavriya also. A Jewish eved and Jewish maid is purchased via a star. Minolan, how do you know that? The pasuk says, Torah talks about in Amar Vriya that if the Amar Vriya ends up marrying his boss and the boss takes another wife, he has to treat his Amar Vriya wife with the same respect that he treats the next wife. And Hikisha Kasul, the Torah compared the Amar Vriya to a wife, right? The Torah just compared an Amar Vriya to a wife. Ma acheres mikanya b'shtar, af Amar Vriya mikinyanya b'shtar. Just like you purchase a woman, we know Kesef Shtar Bia. So also, if you want to purchase an Amma Avriya, a Jewish maid, she's bought with a star. Hanik. So the Gemara says like this. Remember, if you're comparing it to a woman, by Kedushin, the husband writes the star, right? The purchaser writes the star. Husband is buying the girl, right? So therefore, if you're saying by an Amma Avriya, you can purchase an Amma Avriya via a star, it must be that the purchaser, which is the boss, the Adain, he's the one that writes the star. So everything makes perfect sense. This limud of a Mecheres Yikach is good according to the opinion that holds that the star of an Amar Avriya, the master writes it. That the seller, here, the father is selling his daughter into a shibud. If you're telling me that he writes the star, then what's your source for star? Because it's not compared to a Kidushin. Kidushin, the purchaser writes the star, and by Amavriya, according to an opinion, the seller, the father, writes the star. The Itma, star Amavriya mi kaisve. We learned in the teaching that who writes the star for an Amavriya on this transaction. Huna says the master writes it. So the Gemara says, everything makes perfect sense. Le Rav Huna. Everything makes perfect sense according to Rav Huna, because this lines itself up with a regular Kedushin. By regular Kedushin, the purchaser, and by an Amavriya, the purchaser, the Adam writes it. El Rav Chizda, Ma'ikla Meima. Rav Chizda, he says the father, the seller, writes the star. So what is the source for, according to Rav Chizda, that you could buy? There's a transaction. The transaction for a Amavriya can work with a star. We need another source. Amar Rav Acha Yankov, Amakra. The Rav Acha Yankov says, the pasuk says, Loi seitze kitzei schwavodim. The Torah says by an Avriya, she does not leave like a regular Evet Kanaini leaves. In other words, the Torah says, that this Amavriya is not a goyish slave. So, and she doesn't leave like a goyish slave. We know a goyish slave stays forever, except if you knock its eye and teeth out, then it goes free. But an Amavriya, if you knock its eye and teeth out, she still remains an Amma. She still remains a maid, but you have to pay her for the knocking of the eye or the teeth. So, what does the Torah say? She doesn't go out like an Evet Kanani, but the Torah is stressing Avol Niknes Hu Kikinya Avodim. She's purchased the way Evet Kanani are purchased. Manihu star, just like you could purchase an Evet Kanani with a star, so you could purchase an Amavriya and an Evet Ivri with a star. So the Gemara says, maybe let us say, there's another way to purchase an Evet Kanani. You make him work for you. So that's called chazaka. So therefore, I would say that what the Torah says, that the Amavriya is compared to an Evet Kanani, is that it also is purchased with chazaka, but not that it's purchased via a star. Amakrab, so the Gemara says, the pasuk says, "V'nischaltem oisel of nechem achrechem." There's a limit pasuk that says that certain kinyanim only apply by an Evet Kanani and not by a Jewish Evet, and that is chazaka. We darshan oisim b'chazaka. Only an Evet Kanani gets purchased with a chazaka, but loy acher ba'achazaka, but not an Amavriya. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Ve'ema oisim b'shtar. Let's say the limit by Evet Kanani says only an Evet Kanani is purchased a star, v'loy acher b'shtar. But nobody else, but an Amavriya is not purchased with a star. So the Gemara says, but the pasuk says the opposite. that she in some ways an Amavriya's transactions is similar to the way you purchase an Evet Kanani. So what gives? In other words, we have one pasuk that says that an Amavriya is like an Evet Kanani. Another pasuk that says that an Amavriya is not like an Evet Kanani. So why do we say that in a star purchase, using a star, they're similar, and using chazaka, they're not similar? That means that's what the pasuk is limiting. Umara Iso. what made you see it this way? So the Gemara says, Mistavra shtar havilerubuya. I want to say that shtar really works to be included by an amavriya. Keimatzia b'bas Yisrael. By a bas Yisrael, shtar works. We see it working by gittin. So therefore, and we see it working by kedushin also. So therefore, it probably works also by an amavriya. So when you're buying a little girl for a slave, you can use a shtar. So the Gemara says, Adarabba, chazaka aveleru. Let's include chazaka, shekain koine b'nichsei ager, that we find to purchase the possessions of a ger dies and he leaves no inheritors. The first one that grabs it and does something to it and shows ownership of it, that's who it belongs to. So chazaka seems to have universal properties. So we should include a chazaka in a way to purchase an amavriya. And says the Gemara, be'ishus mirlei chashkam. In marriage, we don't find chazaka works. In other words, this point of you buying an amavriya, who buys a little girl for an amma to be a maid? The point that the Torah wanted you to buy this amavriya so that you eventually marry her. So therefore, since it has it leads up to marriage if it's done the right way, therefore shtar is the right kinyan for it, the right kinyan, not chazaka. If you want, I could tell you, that's why I need the pasuk in Acheres to teach you that it's similar to a kedusha isha. So therefore, that pasuk helps modify the other pasuk of Leiseitze Kitsei Savonim, that it's only shtar they're similar, but not in anything else, not by chazaka. Rav Huna, what does he use that pasuk? He has a macheres yikachloi to teach you shtar. He doesn't need loiseitzik. Answers the Gemara, that a amavriya, if you knock out its eye and tooth, she doesn't go free. That's what it means. Loiseitze, a Jewish girl, does not get the free pass like an Evet Kanani leaves. Rav Chizda. What is Rav Chizda? How does he know that idea? In Kain Likos called Leiseitze, it says Leiseitze Ka'avodim. My Kitseis Avodim, Shma Minor Tarti. You see two ideas from the pasuk. There's an extra word Kitseis. So from Leiseitze Ka'avodim teaches you that she doesn't go out Baroshe Ivarim like a regular Evet Kanani. And it also teaches you that she doesn't leave like an Evet Kanani, but you acquire her the same way an Evet Kanani is acquired, which is shtar. So the Gemara just now brought two sources of possibility of how do you know an Evet Kanani or an Evet Ivri, a Jewish Evet, or an Amavriya are purchased via a shtar. The kindness atzmai, Evet Ivri goes free b'shonim when his term is up. What is his term? The pasuk says, he works for 6 years, and the 7th year goes free. Now, it doesn't mean Shemitah he goes free. He has to work for 6 years straight, no matter what. And the 7th year he goes free. Sometimes it goes free by Yovel. If the Jubilee year comes, then he goes free. So these are psukim. Now, the pasuk also, the Mishnah says, B'geroi Kesef. If he comes up with the money to buy himself out, and he redeems himself, then he goes free. Amma Chizkiah, how do you know that? Amma Krav, the Hefta, she redeems herself. The Amavriya redeems herself, and that applies by an Eved Ivri as well. You deduct how much she worked and how much the guy paid, and you figure out what the right redemption value of her, considering what's left in her term, and that's how much she has to pay to acquire her freedom. Tana, we learned in the Brisa. The koines atzmi bekesef v'shav kesef v'shtar. She goes free with kesef, shav kesef v'shtar. So bishlam kesef, I understand kesef, that if she gives money back to the boss, the ksiv bekesef miknase. Shav kesef nami yashav gulase marachamel rabba shav kesef kekesef. That means that if somehow the eved comes up with money, he gets an inheritance or something like that, or wins a lottery, or he wins a car or something, he can give it over to the adain and acquire his freedom back. What does it mean that an Eved Ivri goes free with a shtar? Does that mean that the Eved Ivri writes, please let me go free, and I'll owe you the money that to redeem myself? Well, that's not a novelty of shtar. That's the redemption of kesef. Ela shichra. Do you mean that the odaim, without anything, the master writes a shtar, a freedom document, you could go free to the Eved? Shtar lamali. Why does the master have to write a shtar for an eved ivri? Let him say in front of two people, Zil, you can go. Go to Bezin, Zil, you can go. And it's a verbal thing because when you buy an eved ivri, it's unlike buying an eved kanani. An eved kanani, you own the body. So therefore, when you want to make him go free, you have to write a freedom document, like a get isha, a get shikhr. But for when you buy an eved ivri, it's just buying an employee. They don't really own the body. So why does the Brisa say that a way to free an eved ivri is by writing a shtar? Amar says zoysemeres. From here you see eved ivri gufoy kani. In the eved ivri also in some way, and this you have to think about, that you actually own his body. It's not so simple, and therefore the master that forgives his just what's owed to him, that doesn't make her. That's not a freedom. You actually have to write that you are free to go. So the Gemara, Yisera of Amar Vriya, that the Amar Vriya has one thing more than a girl who's a slave. She has one thing more, that the way she goes free if she has simonim. That means she shows puberty, signs of puberty. Let's say she has 2 hairs under her armpit. So Amar Shlakish, that's what the Mishnah says. Amar Shlakish, the Shlakish says, Amar Vriya, a Jewish girl who's a maid, koinis asma b'misas adam rishus adam. Wow. If she was sold and she's working by the master, if her father who sold her died, she gets a free pass. She goes free. Why? If a girl brings 2 simonim, 2 hairs under her armpit, she's a 12-year-old girl, she's not released from the jurisdiction of her father. Father could still be made for her neder. But that will give her a free pass. Simonim will give her a free pass from the master. If the father dies, so of course he doesn't own her anymore, and it doesn't go to the kids, so certainly it could release her from the other. So Rish Lakish came up with this crazy idea, so to speak, is that in Amar Vriya, she was sold as a maid, and now, while she's a maid, her father who sold her died. She goes free. And the Rish Lakish derived it from a Kal V'chomer. So the Gemara asked 3 questions. Meisvei Rav Shai asked the question against Rish Lakish. You say all of Amar Vriya. Our Mishnah says that Amar Vriya has one way to go out free. Then Isa Nisnami Misasav. Our Mishnah only says Simonim is the way to go out, not when the father dies. So the Gemara says, so why doesn't it say if Rish Lakish was correct, the Mishnah should give you another way she goes out if her father dies? And says the Gemara, Tana B'Shaya, our Mishnah left it out. By Shai the High Shai, what did the Mishnah leave out? So that it left out this. She or Mrs. Adam. The Mishnah did not leave, the Mishnah did not say that if the master dies and then she doesn't go working for the children, since it didn't say Misas Ha'adain when the Adain dies, so therefore it left out Misas Ha'av. So the Gemara says that's not a leaving, that's not something left out of the Mishnah. Misas Adam Lav Shiuri, that's not called leaving it out. The Kiba the Ikanama Bi'ish Loikatani, since this applies by an Eved Ivri, it's exclusively only for Amar Vriya, so therefore the Mishnah didn't say it. But Misas Ha'av is an exclusive thing for Amar Vriya. There's no Misas Ha'av by an Eved Ivri. It's Amar Vriya who's a little girl who's being sold. So the Mishnah should have said it. Ve'elanisni. Why doesn't the Mishnah say it? Answers the Gemara, the reason Mishnah didn't leave it out, Tana Davash Yesh Kitzba Katani. Only if something that has an absolute time when it can happen. Davash Ein Lo Kitzba, something that doesn't have a set time when it can happen, like Katani. So therefore, the Mishnah only lists out, let's say you go free after 6 years, after Yovel, but it doesn't mention anything that could happen at any time. Says the Gemara, Simonim, when a girl has Simonim, shows Simonim, that can happen at any time. And yet the Mishnah does list it. So why didn't it list Mrs. Av, which can happen at any time as well? Rav Safra says, the truth is that a father dying, you can never tell when the father's going to die. So that is not an absolute time that it could happen. But Simonim, Ein Lahem Kitzvah Lamala, we don't know exactly when it'll come after she turns 13. Yesh Lahem Kitzvah Lamata. We go to Amid Beis. We have a kitzvah when if she sows Simonim, it's not worth anything. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa, Ben Teisha Shonim Shevi Shtei Sa'ares, even if she's 9 years old and she brings 2 Sa'ares Shuma, that's considered like a wart. That's not considered Simonim. Mi Ben Tesh Shonim B'Yom Echad, if she's 9 years old in one day, Ad Ben Yud Beis Shonim B'Yom Echad, V'oidem Boy, and it stayed with her after. So that means the hair came out, let's say when she was 10 years old, and that hair stayed with her till after she's 12. Shuma, that's still considered a wart. It has to grow according to the Tanna Kama after she's 12. Rabbi Yosef ben Yehuda in a simon, that's a simon. Ben Gimel Yom Shon of Yamecha, but after 12, already 13, she sows these simonim. Divri Hakol simon, that's a simon. So simonim is very different than Misas Av. Misas Av, you don't know if it can happen. Most women are not, maybe the Av will never die. But simonim, there's no simon when it'll actually occur, but we know for sure that when it occurs at a certain time, it's worthless. It's not anything. So that's why the Mishnah lists that, but not the Misas Ha'av. Back into the question of the Gemara. Again, Rav, we're going to challenge Resh Lakish, and we'll do one more question, and then we'll stop. Basiv Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes asked the question against Resh Lakish. Resh Lakish says that if a father sold his daughter into what? Into service, and then she's working by the Adon, right? And then he dies, she goes free. So Basiv Rav Sheshes asked the question from a Brisa. The Brisa says, Reb Shimon says, Dalid Manikin Loy. There are 4 people, Manikin Loy, get gifts when they live. Gimel be'ish, v'gimel be'isha. 3 by a man and 3 by a woman, right? Three types of avodim leave. And the Gemara learned now that the 3 by a man is yoytze b'sheish, or somebody leaves by yoivel, or a nirtza, which applies by an ish, right? But the same 3 would apply by isha, except you take out nirtza because there's no such a thing of the ear pierced by an isha, and you put in simonim. Because if you ain't someone you can't say 4, so because Ritzia doesn't apply by Isha and Simonim don't apply by Ish. Then Isa, if there's another way that an Amavri goes free, Nisni Nami Misa Av, let it say Misa Sa'av, that the Av, when the Av died, she goes free, and therefore there's another way that an Isha goes free, and another way that you would have to give her gifts. When her father dies, she goes free, you give her gifts. That you said that the Mishnah forgot to mention it. The Mishnah says the number 4, and when the Mishnah puts in the number, it means only these 4, and there's nothing else. Maybe you want to say that the Mishnah is only talking about things that have a set time, but things that don't have a set time, it doesn't mention. But the Mishnah does mention simanim. And so, therefore, that's included into that brisa. That there's a difference between Simon and Misas Adam, Misas Av, Misas Adam, the Einla Kizba, Ukatani. One of the items that we are assuming that the brisa is talking about is when the Adam dies, as one of the 3 that when they go free, you give him gifts. So it's mentioning Misas Adon. So the question again against Rish Lakish is, why by a issue you're only saying there are 3 ways they get presents. One is Sheishanim, when they go out Yovel, when the Adon dies, but there's a 4th way they get a present, when their father dies. So that's a question against Rish Lakish. Answers the Gemara, Misas Adon Nami. That brisa doesn't say Misas Adon. It only mentions 3, but the 3 is not anybody dying, not the father dying, not the master dying. What are the 4 possibilities? Shonim, if they had the term of 6 years, the Yovel or Yovel. The Yovel Sharatzia, that's another type of Yovel. We break it into 2. Yovel, that if the guy got his ear pierced, and then 2 years later, they're nirtza, so that would go free. So that's 3, but that doesn't apply by a woman. Amavriya b'simanim, and Amavriya will be with simanim, but Misas Adon is not included. That's a good way to answer up the brisa. The Tani Seifa, the brisa says, the Tani Seifa, because the brisa says, it's impossible to have 4 ways of freedom, not by a man and not by a woman. There's no simanim by a man, and there's no ritzia by isha. But if there's misas adam, v'im isa b'isha, if you want to say that it's possible that misas adam applies by an isha, so then you have 4. So therefore, because even without Ritzia, you still have 4. Shema Mina, so from here you see that it's not including Misas Adon, and therefore it's not including Misas Av. So this brisa is not a question against Rish Lakish. We're going to stop over here by Mosif, Rav Amram, and Tazvav and Beis. Just remember one thing, that we're dealing with this thing, this halacha that's going to be refuted and in the future. But Rosh Lakish said that if a man sells his daughter into slavery, and then he dies, she gets a free pass and goes free. And he had a kal v'chomer from Simonim. So the Gemara is going to continue to challenge it until it says to Yufti the Rish Lakish. Okay, we'll continue with this tomorrow, Be'ez Hashem.